The moment of disrespect didn't arrive with noise or chaos, it came wrapped in something far quieter, something so subtle at first that I almost missed the weight of it. I remember sitting there, believing I was in a space where people understood basic boundaries, where common decency wasn't something you had to fight for. The room felt normal, the kind of normal that makes you relax your guard, and maybe that was my first mistake. I wasn't watching for cruelty because I didn't think I needed to. But disrespect has a way of testing you when you least expect it, when you're most unprepared, when you've become too comfortable with the idea that people won't cross certain lines. I didn't know that the line was already being approached, slowly, deliberately, almost like he wanted to savor the moment before he stepped over it. He walked around with an air of casual arrogance, the kind that doesn't need words to announce itself. It was in his posture, in the way he looked at people like he owned them, like their comfort was negotiable and their feelings optional. I watched him interact with others, brushing off their presence, taking advantage of their politeness, feeding off the idea that no one would challenge him. And maybe that was true for a long time. Maybe no one did. Maybe I wasn't the first person he disrespected, but I was the one he chose that day, at that moment, in that quiet setting where nothing seemed out of place. I didn't know my life was about to shift because of something so small in appearance yet so enormous in meaning. It started with the look he gave me, a look that wasn't openly hostile but carried a strange blend of mockery and entitlement. It was the kind of look that tries to tell you your presence doesn't matter, the kind that tries to shrink you down without ever saying a word. I felt it but brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking, telling myself it wasn't worth making assumptions. I kept my focus on what I was doing, telling myself that silence was the mature choice, that patience was the wiser path. But disrespect rarely stops when you ignore it. It grows. It waits for a moment when it can make the biggest impact. He approached nearer, pretending to be casual, pretending to be just another person walking by. He made small movements, small steps, each one closer than it needed to be, each one designed to test how much I would tolerate. I didn't react, not because I was intimidated, but because I believed he wouldn't take things further. I believed there was still a line, an invisible boundary no one would dare cross. I believed wrong. When he reached my table, he didn't pause, didn't hesitate, didn't reconsider. He leaned in just enough to make the action unmistakable, deliberate, intentional. And with a slow, almost calculated motion, he spat in my plate. Not by accident. Not in a moment of impulsive anger. It was chosen. It was precise. It was meant to degrade. For a second, time didn't move. Everything around me faded into a strange stillness, like the world had stepped back to give space to the weight of what just happened. My eyes fixed on the plate, on the act itself, on the reality that someone had decided that humiliating me was worth the effort. It's a strange thing, the moment you realize how deeply someone underestimates you. It hits harder than the act itself. It reveals more than words ever could. It exposes a truth about how people see you, how they assume you'll react, how they assume you won't. I felt something shift inside me, something I couldn't fully name in that instant but could definitely feel. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just shock. It was a kind of awakening, a clarity that only comes when a boundary has been violated in a way you can't ignore anymore. Disrespect can sometimes be shrugged off, stored away, forgotten, but not this. Not something so direct, so bold, so unapologetic. It was the kind of moment that forces you to look at yourself differently, that forces you to evaluate why you let people get close enough to even attempt it. I didn't react outwardly. My hands stayed still. My face didn't change. There was no sudden outburst, no dramatic confrontation, no loud demand for an apology. But inside, something was unraveling and rebuilding at the same time. The silence wasn't fear, it was calculation. It was the brief space between what happened and what would come after. It was the realization that this moment wasn't just an insult, it was a turning point. Every second after that felt different. The air felt different. The room felt different. Even he felt different, as if he had unknowingly triggered a version of me he wasn't prepared to meet. I looked at him, not with anger but with a stillness that carried far more than rage ever could. He thought he'd made me smaller. He thought he'd won something. He thought humiliation would settle into me like a weight. But what he didn't recognize. The shift inside me didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a loud explosion or a dramatic burst of emotion. It was quiet, almost eerily quiet, like the slow turning of a lock that you didn't even realize had been closed for years. After the moment of disrespect, something inside me began to move, something that had been still for far too long. It wasn't anger at first. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even humiliation. It was recognition of how long I had been swallowing things I shouldn't have, tolerating things I didn't deserve, and staying silent in situations that demanded more from me than silence. It was the kind of inner shift that crept up slowly, like the feeling of dawn just before the first ray of sunlight breaks through. I used to think silence was strength. I used to believe that staying calm made me wiser, more controlled, more mature. People often teach you that reacting means losing, that responding means surrendering your peace, that speaking up is somehow less dignified than walking away. And for a long time, I lived by that belief. I stayed quiet because I wanted to rise above conflict, not sink into it. I tolerated small insults because I convinced myself they weren't worth my energy. I brushed off disrespect because I didn't want to appear petty. I chose calmness even when calmness felt more like suppression than strength. But in that moment, when he crossed the line so boldly, so deliberately, something inside me stopped accepting the idea that silence was noble. Silence, I realized, had become a prison I had willingly stepped into. It had become a mask that protected others more than it protected me. It had become a shield that kept me from claiming the dignity I deserved. And the strange part was that I hadn't even noticed the weight of it until it began to lift. That internal shift felt like the first deep breath after being underwater for too long, the kind of breath that shocks your lungs and reminds you that survival isn't supposed to feel suffocating. As I sat there, still processing what had happened, I felt something inside me align with a new sense of clarity. It was no longer the passive acceptance of this is just how people are or it's better to avoid trouble. Instead, it was the sharp understanding that my silence had been misunderstood. People had taken it as weakness, as permission, as an invitation to push boundaries a little more each time. They assumed quiet meant powerless. They assumed patience meant fear. They assumed my calmness meant I wouldn't ever push back. And maybe that assumption had protected their comfort for a long time, but it had cost me pieces of my self-worth without me even noticing. The shift inside me wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, steady, purposeful. It was the slow emergence of self-respect that had been buried under years of avoiding conflict. It was the realization that I had allowed too many lines to be crossed simply to maintain peace, a peace that didn't really belong to me. I had been giving others the right to treat me however they wished because I kept telling myself I was strong enough to endure it. But endurance isn't the same as dignity. And tolerance isn't the same as respect. My mind went back over all the small moments I had ignored, sarcastic remarks disguised as jokes, dismissive tones passed off as casual conversation, decisions made without my input but affecting me directly. Individually, they seemed insignificant, easy to overlook, easy to forgive. But together, they formed a pattern that I had been too patient to confront. And that moment, that single act of blatant disrespect, didn't create the shift, it revealed it. It exposed what had been simmering beneath the surface, what I had been refusing to acknowledge. I felt myself sitting a little straighter, breathing a little deeper, seeing things a little clearer. The silence I carried inside wasn't passive anymore. It wasn't the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of awakening. It was the silence that comes before a decision is made, the silence that gathers strength, the silence that prepares for change. There's a particular kind of quiet that isn't weakness at all, it's focus. And that was the quiet that settled into me that day. I realized that if I didn't change the way I responded to disrespect, then disrespect would continue to find me. If I didn't redefine my boundaries, people would keep redrawing them for me. If I didn't value my own dignity, then no one else would. It wasn't about revenge in that moment, it was about self-worth. It was about looking at myself and no longer accepting the version of me that kept shrinking to make room for other people's carelessness. The shift inside me made everything look different. The room felt different. My position in it felt different. Even he, the one who committed the act, looked different, not powerful, not intimidating, but small, exposed, desperate for attention he didn't deserve. The moment he tried to break me was the exact moment I stopped being breakable. Something had changed, not outside but inside, and once that transformation begins, it doesn't go back. It doesn't shrink. It doesn't dim. It grows, quietly. Realizing the power of dignity over humiliation didn't happen in a sudden flash, it unfolded slowly, like a curtain being pulled back to reveal something that had been in front of me all along but somehow never fully seen. I had always thought that humiliation was something external, something done to you, something that others inflicted. But in that moment, after the act that crossed every boundary, I began to understand that humiliation only becomes powerful when you let it define you. What he did was an attempt to strip something away from me, to make me feel small, to make me question myself, to push me into a corner. But dignity isn't something that can be stolen by someone else's behavior. It's something rooted deep inside, something no one can touch unless you hand it over willingly. As I sat there, staring at the plate he had spit into, I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not the calm of someone who is numb, not the calm of someone who is shocked into silence, but the calm of someone who is seeing themselves clearly for the first time in a long time. I realized that dignity isn't loud, and it doesn't need to announce itself. Dignity doesn't fight for attention or demand validation. It exists quietly, like a steady pulse, reminding you that your worth isn't dictated by the actions of others. Humiliation is loud, chaotic, meant to provoke a reaction. But dignity is steady, unwavering, a reminder of who you are when the world tries to tell you otherwise. I had a choice in that moment, a choice I didn't fully see before. I could have reacted impulsively, let anger take over, let humiliation define the next few seconds of my life. I could have shouted, confronted him loudly, or created a scene. And no one would have blamed me. But dignity isn't about proving a point through noise. It's about knowing your value so deeply that you refuse to let someone else decide how you should feel. And as strange as it sounds, that realization felt like reclaiming something I didn't even know I had lost. I thought about all the times in my life when I had confused silence with submission, when I believed that avoiding conflict meant I was choosing peace. But peace without dignity is just quiet suffering. Peace built on self-erasure isn't peace at all. And for the first time, I understood that protecting my dignity had nothing to do with reacting aggressively and everything to do with responding intentionally. Humiliation is meant to bend you, to make you fold inward, to make you question your place in the world. But dignity straightens your spine. It brings your head up, not in arrogance but in self-respect. As I replayed his action in my mind, the more I saw it, the more I realized how little it said about me and how much it revealed about him. His behavior wasn't a reflection of my worth, it was a reflection of his emptiness. People who attempt to humiliate others are often battling something deeply wrong within themselves. They try to tear others down because they cannot build themselves up. They seek control because they have none elsewhere. And the moment you recognize that, their power dissolves. Dignity also brings clarity. Clarity about who deserves your energy, your presence, your responses. Clarity about what kind of treatment you will no longer tolerate. Clarity about how you see yourself moving forward. I felt that clarity settling inside me like a truth I should have known long ago. I realized that nothing he did could change my value unless I allowed it to. My worth didn't shrink because of his behavior. My self-respect didn't weaken because of his intention. In fact, his attempt at humiliation only strengthened something inside me that had been dormant. I started to understand that dignity isn't about avoiding conflict, it's about choosing your battles from a place of strength rather than reaction. It's about knowing that your response should serve you, not the person trying to provoke you. Humiliation tries to reduce you to a moment, but dignity reminds you of your whole story. And in that story, one act of disrespect doesn't define you. What defines you is how you rise above it, how you transform it, how you choose to move through it without letting it poison the deeper parts of you. I felt myself rise internally, not physically but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. It was as if something inside me whispered that no one, not him, not anyone, gets to determine how I see myself. No one gets to take from me what they never gave me in the first place. Dignity comes from within. It is earned through experiences, shaped by resilience, protected by self-awareness. And in that moment, something inside me claimed it with a firmness I had never felt before. I realized that the real strength isn't in reacting quickly but in understanding deeply. The real victory isn't in proving someone wrong but in knowing they never had the power to define you. Humiliation wants you to shrink, but dignity teaches you to stand. Humiliation wants you to feel powerless, but dignity reminds you of the quiet authority you carry. Humiliation is a moment, but dignity is a mindset. And as that understanding settled into me, the anger faded, the shock dissipated, and what remained was a grounded, unshakable certainty that I would never again let someone else's actions determine my sense of worth. Strategic patience wasn't something I fully understood before that moment. I used to think patience meant waiting quietly, keeping the peace, avoiding unnecessary conflict, or choosing calmness simply because reacting felt exhausting. But that day taught me that patience can be something completely different, something powerful, deliberate, and sharper than any impulsive reaction. Patience, when used with intention, becomes a strategy, not a surrender. It becomes a form of strength that doesn't need to roar to be felt. It becomes the quiet calculation that prepares you to act not out of emotion but out of clarity. And as I sat there, processing what had happened, that clarity began to form inside me in ways I had never experienced before. The first instinct when someone crosses such an obvious line is to react immediately. To stand up, to confront, to demand respect, to reclaim control through loudness or force. But something held me back, not out of fear, not out of shock, but out of understanding. I knew instinctively that reacting in the way he wanted me to would only feed his ego. People who humiliate others crave attention, crave chaos, crave the satisfaction of seeing you lose control. They want the reaction more than the act itself. If I had reacted impulsively, I would have given him exactly what he wanted. Instead, I chose something he never expected: stillness. Strategic patience isn't passive. It isn't silence for the sake of avoiding confrontation. It's observing with intention. It's letting the moment settle so you can see it clearly from every angle. It's holding your emotions long enough to ensure that when you do act, your actions come from power, not from wounded pride. I felt that kind of patience rising within me like a quiet wave. I watched him walk away with the same arrogance he had arrived with, completely unaware that his attempt to break me had only awakened something inside me. He thought his action had ended the interaction, but for me, it was only the beginning of a new approach to who I was and how I handled people like him. I didn't need to match his disrespect with anger. I didn't need to meet his hostility with confrontation. I could do something far more effective. I could respond with patience that wasn't driven by fear, but by strategy. In that silence, I began noticing things I had overlooked before. The way people around him reacted to him. The subtle unease in their posture when he came too close. The avoidance in their eyes, the forced laughter, the quick agreement to whatever he said. It became clear that he wasn't respected, he was tolerated. And there's a difference. People who crave dominance often mistake tolerance for admiration. They don't realize that the silence around them isn't respect, it's discomfort. Strategic patience allowed me to see that clearly, to understand that I didn't need to fight someone who was already losing in ways he couldn't see. The more I observed, the clearer my path became. I didn't want revenge fueled by rage. I didn't want to stoop to his level or mirror his behavior. What I wanted was to act in a way that elevated me, not degraded me. I wanted whatever came next to reflect my dignity, not his disrespect. And patience became the tool that allowed me to filter out every impulsive thought and uncover the choice that aligned with who I wanted to be. I realized that responding strategically meant understanding the deeper purpose behind my actions. It meant asking myself what outcome I wanted. Did I want him to feel small the way he tried to make me feel? Did I want to embarrass him in front of others? Did I want to confront him with anger just to satisfy the moment? Or did I want something more lasting? Something that would shift the power dynamic not just for one moment but permanently? The answer became clear as I sat there. I wanted him to understand something he had never understood, that dignity doesn't need noise to make its presence known. That strength doesn't always stand up instantly, Sometimes it waits for the right moment. That retaliation rooted in clarity is far more powerful than reaction rooted in emotion. Strategic patience gave me that power. It allowed me to step outside the moment emotionally and see it with a level of detachment that wasn't cold but composed. I also realized that patience gave me control not over him, but over myself. It kept my emotions from owning me. It kept humiliation from taking hold. It kept me from making choices I would regret. It reminded me that the real victory wasn't in reacting, it was in choosing how to respond. And I wanted my response to be deliberate, meaningful, and rooted in self-respect. As time passed, the internal storm settled into a kind of sharp focus. I felt myself thinking more clearly than I had all day, as if the shock had carved out space in my mind for a deeper understanding. I knew that the next steps I took would be different from anything I had done before. Not because I needed revenge, but because I had stepped into a new understanding of myself. Strategic patience had transformed the moment from an emotional wound into a turning point that I could shape intentionally. And as I watched the situation from a distance, I recognized that the person he thought I was, the quiet one, the passive one, the one who wouldn't fight back, no longer existed. Transforming anger into purposeful action is a process that doesn't begin with fury, it begins with understanding. In the immediate aftermath of what happened, anger did rise within me. Not the wild, uncontrollable kind that blinds you, but a steady heat that built itself slowly, like a flame trying to decide what it wants to become. Anger by itself is raw, unfocused, and often destructive. It wants to burst out, to be felt, to be released immediately. But in that moment, I realized that if I allowed my anger to lead the way, it would control me instead of empowering me. So I held it, not to suppress it, but to shape it. Purposeful action doesn't come from the first spark of emotion, it comes from what you choose to do with that spark. I began to notice something important. Anger wasn't the enemy. Misguided anger was. Anger without direction becomes self-sabotage, but anger with clarity becomes transformation. It becomes fuel. It becomes intention. It becomes the force that pushes you from being someone who endures to someone who acts. I let my anger settle in my chest, giving it space but not giving it power. I examined it, figured out where it came from, not just from the disrespect of that single moment, but from years of allowing small pains to pass unnoticed, from tolerating things that should have been confronted long ago, from shrinking myself in the name of peace that never truly existed. This anger wasn't new, it was accumulated. And now, it demanded direction. There's a point where anger can either destroy you or sharpen you, and the only difference lies in the choices you make while feeling it. I chose to let it sharpen me. Instead of seeing the situation as a humiliation, I began to see it as a catalyst. Something inside me whispered that this moment was not meant to break me, it was meant to wake me. Wake me from complacency, from silence, from the habit of accepting less than what I deserved. And the more I embraced that perspective, the more my anger transformed from a reaction into a resource. Purposeful action requires clarity about what matters. I asked myself what outcome would truly serve me. Was it confrontation? Was it revenge? Was it humiliating him in return? Those choices might have satisfied a momentary impulse, but they wouldn't have built anything lasting. They would have tied me to the same level he operated on, a level fueled by ego, insecurity, and the desire to dominate. I didn't want that. I didn't want to become a reflection of his behavior. I wanted to rise above it, not simply to distance myself from him, but to redefine who I was in the face of disrespect. I began to understand that purposeful action means acting in alignment with your values, not your emotions. It means choosing a path that protects your dignity while still addressing the wrongdoing. It means responding in a way that creates impact, not chaos. So instead of acting instantly, I allowed my thoughts to settle. I replayed the moment, not to relive the pain but to analyze the motivations behind his actions. I realized that people like him operate on the assumption that others won't stand up, that silence is weakness, that quiet people are easy to manipulate or disrespect. He didn't expect resistance because he didn't think I had it in me. That realization didn't humiliate me, it empowered me. It gave my anger a direction. I started to see the bigger picture, The one anger often hides. Purposeful action isn't about the moment, it's about the outcome. It's about creating change that extends beyond the initial hurt. I wanted to make sure that what I did next wouldn't come from a place of emotional eruption but from a place of strength. And strength rooted in clarity has far more impact than strength rooted in anger alone. As hours passed, my anger settled into a quiet determination. I no longer felt the urge to lash out. I didn't want to shout or confront or match disrespect with disrespect. Instead, I wanted to make choices that would alter the dynamic completely. Choices that would show him and everyone else that I wasn't someone who could be pushed, tested, or diminished without consequence, but that my response would be shaped by my values, not my rage. Purposeful action also requires patience, not the passive kind but the strategic kind. I waited for the right moment, the right setting, the right opportunity to address what had happened. Not when emotions were boiling, not when he expected it, but when the power had shifted back to me mentally. By the time that moment arrived, I no longer felt anger as a burden. It became a guide. It kept me from wavering, kept me focused, kept me sure of why I needed to act and what I hoped to accomplish. I knew that purpose-driven action isn't meant to crush someone, it's meant to reclaim your own authority. It's meant to restore what disrespect attempted to dismantle. It's meant to remind you of the strength you carry when you stand firmly in who you are. And the beauty of transforming anger into intention is that it allows you to act without regret. It allows you to look back and know you responded not out of impulse, but out of conviction. And so my anger, once sharp and hot, cooled into something steady and unwavering. It became clarity. It became direction. It became the foundation for every step I decided to take next. Taking back control wasn't a single decision, it was a series of small, deliberate moments that slowly rebuilt the parts of me that had been chipped away over time. It didn't start with a dramatic declaration or a bold confrontation. It began quietly, in the space between realizing what I deserved and recognizing what I had allowed. There's a kind of power that grows when you stop waiting for others to treat you right and decide to redefine the standard yourself. That power doesn't come from anger or revenge, it comes from clarity, from understanding your worth deeply enough that you refuse to let anyone else diminish it again. In the aftermath of everything, I found myself thinking not just about what happened, but about why it had been so easy for him to think he could get away with it. It wasn't because he was strong. It wasn't because he had any real authority. It was because I had spent too long playing small, too long giving people the benefit of the doubt, too long assuming silence would protect me. Taking back control meant examining all the ways I had contributed to my own mistreatment, not because I was at fault, but because I finally understood that unspoken boundaries are invisible to people who don't care to look. I began to rebuild those boundaries, not with walls meant to keep people out, but with clarity meant to protect my dignity. I told myself that I would no longer excuse disrespect, even the subtle kind that hides behind jokes or casual comments. I wouldn't swallow discomfort just to avoid conflict. I wouldn't prioritize someone else's comfort over my own self-respect. Control, I realized, isn't about dominating a situation, it's about choosing how you show up in it. And I wanted to show up with strength, not hesitation. Every thought that crossed my mind during those hours after the incident became part of my transformation. I questioned the habits I had developed, the roles I had accepted, the situations where I had allowed others to treat me as if my feelings were optional. It was uncomfortable at first, seeing the ways I had stayed quiet when I should have spoken. But discomfort often signals growth. It forces you to confront truths you've ignored. It pushes you to evolve. And I welcomed that discomfort because it was the first step toward reclaiming everything I had slowly lost. Taking back control also meant refusing to let humiliation write my story. I didn't want a single incident to define me or shape my future interactions. I wanted to choose what came next, not simply react to what had already happened. That shift in perspective changed everything. Instead of replaying the moment with anger or shame, I started thinking about what it taught me about myself, about others, about the way people behave when they think no one will hold them accountable. And with every realization, I felt myself stepping more firmly into who I wanted to be. Control isn't always expressed through action. Sometimes it's expressed through stillness, through choosing not to engage in certain battles, through walking away from situations that don't deserve your presence. I learned that I didn't have to prove anything to him or anyone else. The moment I decided that his behavior said nothing about my worth was the moment I reclaimed the power he tried to take. He didn't get to define me. He didn't get to control my emotions. He didn't get to shape the narrative. I did. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that control begins internally long before it manifests externally. It begins with the decision to stop giving others the authority to influence your sense of self. It begins with acknowledging your own strength, even if you haven't used it in a long time. It begins with trusting yourself to handle the situation with intention instead of impulse. And that internal shift eventually becomes visible in everything you do, in your posture, in your decisions, in the way you carry yourself. I noticed the difference in the way I approached him afterward, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with a confidence that didn't need to announce itself. I didn't need to raise my voice or force a confrontation. The control I had regained showed in my calmness, in my certainty, in the way I refused to let him occupy my mind any longer than necessary. He expected anger, chaos, maybe even retaliation. What he didn't expect was composure. Composure unsettles the kind of person who thrives on seeing others lose themselves. As I moved forward, I made decisions that reflected the new version of myself. I stopped internalizing other people's behavior as a measure of my value. I stopped shrinking into silence when something felt wrong. I stopped ignoring the instincts that told me when someone's intentions weren't harmless. Taking back control meant rewriting the rules I lived by, not to make myself harder, but to make myself stronger. There's a quiet power in knowing you have the ability to walk away from anyone who tries to undermine you. A strength in knowing you can address disrespect without letting it consume you. A dignity in choosing responses rooted in self-respect instead of hurt. When I embraced that power, something inside me settled, as if a part of me that had been lost finally returned home. And even though the moment that sparked this transformation was ugly, what it created within me was something strong, steady, and unshakable. The kind of strength that doesn't need to be loud. The kind of strength that doesn't seek revenge. The kind of strength that simply refuses to be diminished again.